Prue, eating disorder therapist, teacher and podcaster, and you're about to start healing from your eating disorder and transforming your life and your relationship with food and body. I've worked in NHS and private practice supporting clients for 20 years, and I believe that recovery is possible for you. This podcast dives into expert interviews, evidence-based psychological approaches, and anecdotal tips from the therapy room from my years of experience. If you're wanting to heal your relationship with food, feel confident in your body, develop self-love and self-acceptance, and create a life of freedom and meaning, then this podcast is for you. Thank you for being here.
So today I have a guest on the show, and I am talking to Prue, a mother of one in her 40s who has type 1 diabetes and has recovered from anorexia nervosa. Prue has been very generous today in sharing her recovery story. She experienced extremely challenging times as a child, having what she calls a textbook narcissistic father. She was then sent to boarding school at a young age and separated from her siblings and support network, feeling very abandoned. She then developed type 1 diabetes and was navigating this condition pretty much in isolation. Prue developed anorexia nervosa as a life raft and coping strategy to keep her safe amongst all the difficulties. And today she shares her story openly, describing some of the things that have helped her in healing, to the point where she's in a healthy romantic relationship and has a little boy. She talks about boundaries in place with family and how she has found a much greater peace in life. I hope that you enjoy the conversation.
Time for a short advertisement break. Are you a counsellor, dietitian, therapist, nutritionist, personal trainer, or other mental health professional? Are you seeing increasing numbers of your clients struggling with eating disorders and disordered eating? And are you keen to learn skills and strategies and build confidence in working with your clients who struggle with these issues? We know that increasing numbers of people are struggling with eating disorders, and we know that 85% of people with eating disorders are not underweight, and this means that many eating disorder symptoms are hidden. The Good Childhood Report in 2021 highlights appearance as a leading cause of unhappiness among young people and indicates that appearance concerns are increasing year upon year. So join my Eating Disorders Training Day on Zoom, face-to-face, or self-paced online. It will give you a really good understanding about the different types of eating disorders, including anorexia, bulimia, binge eating disorder, and OSFED, with an introduction to RFED and neurodiversity and eating disorders. You'll explore typical causes of eating disorders and understand how to create a psychological formulation for your client, and this will be brought to you by relating to client examples. I will take you through then my specific knowledge, skills, and techniques, which can be used when supporting clients with eating disorders. You will get a full comprehensive training manual and access to the recording of the training afterwards and a full online version of the course. If you want to sign up, please go to the eatingdisordertherapist.co.uk, and you might also be interested in my body image training for professionals too.
Hi, Prue. Great to have you here today, and welcome to the podcast.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much.
So Prue, could I firstly get you to introduce yourself to the listeners, please?
Yes, of course. Gosh, I'm in my 40s now. It feels very strange to say that. I am a mother to a little boy, and in my earlier than teens, I suffered an eating disorder, which sort of came about through various reasons, but really kind of, even now I would say, and I know that's not what people want to hear, but it's had its claws in me really in various different ways, gone through all the different sort of variations and grey areas of eating disorders. But yes, I didn't want to start with that. I wanted to say I'm a mum, and that's how I like to be seen first.
Oh, no, lovely. Well, thank you for sharing. And I know you're going to talk to us a bit today about your journey, and I guess some of the things that perhaps have really supported you in your ongoing recovery journey. Thank you so much for coming on that and being prepared to share, because I know the listeners really, really value actually just hearing people's personal experiences. So helpful.
Yes, I really hope that if there is someone out there who's sort of in a similar boat, similar circumstances or situation, it's so varied how people get affected by eating disorders and how different it is for everyone. And it doesn't always follow the textbook look always. And if someone else is in a similar situation, it's nice if they can think, well, it's not just me.
So, Prue, I know you have type 1 diabetes and you have also suffered from various eating disorders. Could I get you to launch in a little bit to tell us a bit about your story and a bit about kind of how you came to develop an eating disorder?
Yes, I would love to. My home life when I was young, so I'm talking younger than 10, was quite dysfunctional. I do have a textbook narcissist for a father. That sounds very brutal and blunt, but that is what it is. He's got the exact traits that you would expect. My mother, and we're talking back in the 80s, at the time when women didn't have quite as much freedom in terms of being single. It was very judgmental, having a job. She was very much a stay-at-home mum, but the effects of, I think, putting up with a narcissist meant that she adopted traits probably to cope. And now I look back, it was a really tough environment to be in, a lot of shouting, there was physical abuse at points. And my father, in that very narcissistic way, wanting to appear to everybody as a very capable, high earning, which we weren't, but that's how he wanted to appear to people, wanted all of his children in boarding school. That was a defining feature of success for him. He obviously painted the picture that was paying for it, which would have been extraordinary. I mean, I have two siblings, so the three of us all to go to boarding school would have been an incredible amount of money. And the truth is, there were a variety of scholarships and assisted places that were achieved. And I know that for my position in a boarding school, they were paying nothing. I was there for nothing, for no fee whatsoever through the schemes that existed at that time. I really suffered at boarding school. Every time I talk about this, I'm surprised at how emotional I get about it still, even to this day. But boarding school was probably the breaking of me as a small child. I was under 10 years old. I was sent to a different school to my siblings, so I didn't have them around. And it was extraordinarily lonely for a young girl. Sometimes you would be left there for weeks and weeks at a time without seeing your family. I developed very strange behaviors to try and cope. And now I look back, I can see them very clearly. But at the time, they were just part of my day where I had to touch certain things in the school in a certain way, in a certain pattern. Otherwise, in my mind, I would convince myself that something bad would happen at home. My house would burn down, something would happen to my siblings. It was very strange connections being created. Probably give myself some element of control where there just wasn't any. I would phone home frequently, probably on the daily, not asking to go home. I knew no one would come to get me, but I would end every phone call asking my mother, I needed her to say, I love you. And I also needed her to say when she was coming to get me next. And I would go and write it down in a little book that I had in a tuck box in the shared space that we had. It was very controlling behavior that I was displaying, and there's no one really to tell. There's no solution. And I think back in the 80s, even the eating disorders, people just didn't know anything about them. They just didn't have the information. They didn't know how to connect it with emotional challenges people were facing. A lot of stress, a lot of emotional struggle going on. And I would think I was in my final year of prep school. I'll go through the symptoms because it might be quite helpful for someone in case you know of anyone or themselves. I was starting to drink a lot of water. I was finding I was thirsty all of the time. Oh, Harriet, between lessons, I would go into the bathroom, I'd fill the sink with water, and I would drink the entire basin of water. I was so thirsty. I had no idea what was going on. Didn't really think to say anything to anyone. Just thought I'd developed a strange level of thirst. It never occurred to me that I should mention it. But my friend at boarding school gave me a carton of full sugar Ribena. Well, you can imagine what that did. If you don't know that you're diabetic, and there's a lot of sugar in Ribena back then, you didn't have your sugar-free version. And that makes you even thirstier and very tired. You're just very tired all the time. And I remember the matron coming in and she said, well, what's wrong with you? And I said, I'm so tired and I'm so thirsty and I don't know what's going on. And it was her and the headmistress, bless them, they had me tested and I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And my first thought in my mind when I went off to the sanatorium was, well, this is it. This will be my gateway home. I can't do this by myself at school. I'm too young. I need help. I need support. I was kind of taken into hospital. I was told about managing my food and carbohydrates and I was given all this nutritional information that I was probably, I mean, it's good for everybody to have some knowledge, but I think it was too much knowledge for someone my age at that point. And off I went back to school with my needles and my blood tester and tried to kind of make it work. It was just something else that I'd lost control of. I'd now lost control of my health. I was frustrated every time I had a high blood sugar level and I couldn't understand why it had happened. How can I stop it from happening again? And it was just a roundabout of just frustration and struggling and trying to explain to my parents why it was so hard. And it was essentially falling on deaf ears. And it was really quite hard. And I say that, but I know that there are people who do go to boarding school and do have type 1 diabetes and probably do both at the same time and are absolutely fine. But for me, I think I just didn't have that ability to cope. And I imagine a lot of people who perhaps struggle with eating disorders can relate. I just needed something to focus on. I did have control of that nobody else could touch. And I very slowly started to cut down on my food. I remember being in the sort of dining hall and hiding food under like a plate or a cup, or I didn't want to eat it, or just things like that, and just slowly reducing my food intake. I mean, it didn't take very long for anorexia to really set in and take a hold of me to the point that I then went home for summer and my parents did notice that they couldn't not notice. I was very small and very weak. I was a shadow of myself, and I don't know what I thought I was going to achieve. I don't think I was trying to achieve anything. I just needed something that I knew I had full control of, and that's what I created for myself. But what became really clear, this is almost tragic, is that my parents weren't really focused on me getting better, not mentally supporting me or trying to understand why I was having such a hard time and why this was the result. It was more about how do we get weight back on her so she goes back to school. It was a real focus on I had to be back there. And that was really devastating because it meant that nothing really psychologically was being investigated. I wasn't really being asked questions. It was just a case of just feed her all the time. And it was the arguments and the fights and the struggle that would come out of that. That's what happened. I would put on a bit of weight. I would get back to school. I would lose it again because I needed the control all the way up until I was 18 and I finished. I was really having a hard time. And even though the being underweight, it had spiraled into periods of bulimia as well, where I was throwing up food as well. I just could not get a grip of myself or anything. I was just really emotionally struggling. It never really resolved itself all the way from maybe 10 to 18. And I left school, I was still having these issues. My brain was completely consumed by food, how to avoid it, how not to have anything to do with it, how to be smaller, how to be in control. And as you can imagine, coupled with type 1 diabetes, it's really tricky. You have hypos and you have hypoglycemia and swing between the two. Just very difficult. But the eating disorders always came first, above everything else, including the diabetes and therefore your health. So I finished school. I was still struggling. That's the word I'm saying a lot, but that's where we are. I felt really let down by my parents. I really felt still very lonely in terms of trying to now navigate what I'd created for myself. And I made the decision for university. I was going to move far, far away. So off I went to the other side of the country, found a university I could be far, far away. And I think probably for the first time, truly felt happy because I'd made that choice. And I did manage to get a kind of a foothold with the eating disorder, but it would show back up again in a variety of ways. I would overexercise or I would be vomiting or undereating. It would just rear its head during stressful times. So if I was doing exams or dissertations, I just couldn't get a hold of it. It felt like this was it now. This is how my life will look forever. This is the fight I will have to battle. I do look back now and feel sad because I think there's all that brain space it takes up. And what could have been if I had not had that in my brain, if I'd had more space for passions and learning. And through my sort of early 20s, start your first job and you make friends and you kind of get out there on your own. And the swings were less. I wasn't going to the extremes that I once was. I was still very aware of control. And I think that was the main thing. I was trying to achieve control over things. It was far better in my 20s. Then in my early 30s, I met my now partner and we had our son. And it sounds so cliche, but having type 1 diabetes and going through pregnancy is no joke. It's harder work for me because I was just got through back through 9 months of had a miscarriage first, but then went through the 9 months of pregnancy, constantly concerned about baby. But he arrived safely. It does sound a cliche, but you've got to try and knock this on the head to some degree. Both your eating disorder elements, but also the constant battle with my parents emotionally was still ongoing. When I actually made the decision to go no contact with my parents, I just reached a point where I just couldn't do it anymore. The narcissistic behavior and the lying and the manipulation, I didn't have the time or the brain space for it anymore. I just wanted to be with my partner. I wanted to be with my son. I wanted to navigate through life like a relatively normal human being without all the drama. And ironically, once I made that break from them, the anxiety that I had been feeling, I think I may have had anxiety forever until that point where I kind of went no contact with them and it stopped. The anxiety around them and their behavior just stopped. I do sometimes get it around, for example, I'm feeling it now at Christmas. I get nervous they're going to show up on my doorstep and start throwing a bit crackers. It's always my biggest fear. Hopefully not. Fingers crossed. But the rest of the time, the anxiety is so much less. And I didn't realize how bad it was until it had eased. It sounds so sad, and it is, but I don't regret it. I don't regret it at all. I feel like everybody has the right to protect their peace and just be to achieve feeling okay. Everybody's right in life. Feel safe, feel calm, feel peace. And that's exactly what I had achieved with my son and my partner in our home, which was now my safe space. And I just didn't want them in it anymore. I didn't want them in there painting it for me. I just needed it to be my safe space. That kind of, I mean, to a degree, brings us to present day. And I'm not saying, and then I was cured. I cut off my parents and everything was fine. And my eating disorders were over. I still have a really hard time. Just recently, I thought I was ready to perhaps go on a little bit of a summer body spruce. I'll lose a few pounds and look amazing. Very foolish behavior now looking back because I could see the cycle of eating disorders returning. I was dropping weight quite quickly and then I started binging and I thought, oh, here we go. It was genuinely a choice. It wasn't related to anything stress related. I wasn't trying to control anything emotional. It was the truth thinking, oh, well, I've been okay for a while. I should be fine. It's just not worth it, really. Unfortunately, I have a partner that's very aware, says what he sees, and spotted it immediately and kind of raised it as a red flag, which is very brave of him because, could have started shouting and things. And that kind of brings me to present day. That sounds very sort of dark and morbid. I am in such a better place now, just in terms of emotions and stability, in such a better place. I've probably not touched on the diabetes as much as I should for somebody who has it. As a result, it means that my diabetes is better, the less stress that you can be exposed to, and sort of hormonal swings almost makes a huge difference to your blood sugar levels and how you manage your symptoms. I have a beautiful little boy who is just an incredible person. Aren't all little people incredible? And I feel really lucky because it could have been very different. It could have been very different. Diabetes is no joke when it comes to eating disorders. It can really do some damage if you're not keeping an eye. That brings us to date, Harriet. I hope that wasn't too sort of sad and dark. And
No, I think it's really helpful, Prue, to hear your story. We want to know the authentic reality of what you experienced, I guess. So just thank you for sharing it. I just think so many different threads there actually with just your early life and, like you say, the sort of the narcissistic dad. Sounds like a quite abusive and neglectful environment, that you weren't protected. It sounds like your mum was kind of surviving. Really tough, isn't it, for children in that environment? And then being sent to boarding school, I guess, as well. I can't imagine how that would have been just for a young girl as well. And just that kind of perhaps feeling of when you're not feeling that home is very safe and then being sent away, just that real feeling of being abandoned and not cared for and so alone. I just think so difficult, really. And then the diabetes on top. I mean,
Sorry, I shouldn't laugh.
you couldn't make it up, could you really? Because I have a son with type 1 diabetes. I'm very familiar with diabetes and how challenging that can be. But I think, again, as a young girl, away from family and back in the days when we were relying completely on injections and things aren't as advanced, I mean, I think it's very challenging for a diabetic today still. But back in the 80s or whatever, it was extremely challenging, wasn't it, in terms of blood sugar control and food having to be so much more limited. I just think no wonder you would have started to struggle with food with your kind of history of those difficult experiences and the abandonment and then the diabetes. And it's really interesting, isn't it, I think, as well, you sharing about sort of obsessive compulsive traits that you're using to kind of cope, because it makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? I think as a child, if you feel anxious and you feel out of control and overwhelmed, you will do anything to try and find some safety in your environment. So it makes a lot of sense, I think, that you would have had those little coping strategies. And then I think, in a way, no wonder that you then developed an eating disorder. I think anorexia probably would have felt very safe and something that could give you that sense of control, something to kind of cling to, something to distract from all the other overwhelming stuff. It's quite effective, isn't it? Almost at kind of numbing everything and keeping one safe, and just in a way, very understandable survival strategy. I think it makes so much sense.
The eating disorder always gets painted as the villain. And at the time that I was experiencing it, the 10, 11-year-old, it really wasn't a villain. I genuinely don't know what I would have done, what the alternative might have been if I hadn't developed eating disorder. That's not to say that they are good in any way. They're very, very all-consuming and very disruptive to life. But I just needed it so badly at that moment. Even now, looking back, I don't know who I could have spoken to in a way where I would have got a supportive, helpful response. That's not only my parents, and I don't want to make them sound like villains either, but they were dealing with their own stuff. Their own lives were clearly off the rails. But even at school, I don't know who I could have spoken to. Certainly couldn't have spoken to my siblings. They were also very young. We were all very young. And I think that's also an element of the 80s. We just didn't know in the 80s and 90s. We didn't know what we were doing with eating disorders. We didn't really have a true understanding of why they happened in the way they do different people. The support wasn't there like it is, I think, now. That it's definitely better understood. They're almost like boxes, eating disorders, which I was very aware of. If you've got this, then you are anorexic. If you are doing this, you are bulimic. The crossover and the overlap and do you know what I mean? It's so vast. The grey areas that people fall into, where they then convince themselves that I'm not struggling, is another thing. And I think that's recognised far more now than it was back then, for sure. It was a bit of a minefield. All of that said, and it sounds so dark and very sad, and it is. But I do need to reiterate that where I am now with a lovely little family that we have, and just not that constant anxiety and need for control and to try and grabbing hold of anything that will give me stability is not really there anymore, which I'm really grateful for. I did briefly go to an outpatient facility, and even there, the help wasn't really right needed. And I was rushed back to school anyway because we had to keep up appearances. So, for narcissistic purposes, we needed to keep up appearances. I guess kind of muddled it through alone, really, and just got very, very lucky in that sense. I do think in my 20s, I should have been more proactive about finding someone, because I think by that point, the knowledge was out there and there were enough people that are qualified in the area who could have really helped me. In my 20s, I was, I don't know, busy. I was busy. That's kind of it in a nutshell. I don't know if that provides any comfort to anyone, but I think it's important to understand how diverse the eating disorders are and how they present themselves. It's vast. And for people like you who specialize in this sort of thing, it's so individual. Every person that you must encounter must have such a different experience and combination of environment and emotions that lead them to this place. Certainly not easy, but definitely rewarding, I imagine, when things start to twig. I disassociated very, very hard throughout my eating disorders when they were really bad. I just thought I'd got too much knowledge. I was diabetic and I'd been given too much knowledge about nutrition, and that I was just a very emotionally broken little girl.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing. I guess some of the things that really strike me about sort of things that helped you on your journey as well. You said you went to university and you really made a choice. It was something, perhaps for the first time, you felt you were having a bit more autonomy and felt a little bit of empowerment maybe in that decision, which was helpful. And then you obviously formed a relationship with someone where there's good connection and safety, love, all the things that we kind of need, I suppose, as humans to feel safe. And then had your son, which has obviously been another kind of motivating, rewarding, loving kind of aspect that's sort of been thrown in the mix. But then also as well, putting those boundaries in place with your parents, making that decision not to be in relationship with them, and the difference you felt in your anxiety levels. I just think it's very, very interesting, isn't it? Because we always think with eating disorders, it's all about food, and it kind of is, but it's often about these much deeper things, really. And it strikes me, I guess, for you, Prue, as for many people, actually, relationships have been a really important part, haven't they, of your healing and being able to kind of connect with people, I guess, where you feel safe and where you can be yourself.
It's lovely to hear you speak about it because, like, hit on all of the points. It took me years and years and years to identify. I couldn't put the pieces together. And in 40 minutes, you kind of boundaries and it's not about the food. It's way deeper than that. And it really is. For some bizarre reason, so mind blowing to me when I accepted that I was a young girl. I had absolutely no control over my life. It didn't want to diabetes. I don't want people with diabetes to think, oh, life is so much worse with diabetes. It's not. It was just a challenge at the time. And you've touched on all of those points in the space of 40 minutes. And that's why I think to myself, back in my 20s, I really should have gone to see somebody and been brutally honest and allowed them to help me identify all those things. Because I think it could have got the ball rolling a lot sooner. But I struggled with friendships. In fact, actually, even now, I really struggle with friendships because I always think, oh, if my parents were happy to give me up and leave me somewhere for long periods of time, didn't really want to be around me, then why would any other friends want to, potential friends want to spend any time with me? And for a really long time, I would make connections with people and then I would just get to a point where I leave before they leave me. And I laugh. It's horrible behavior where you would just kind of abandon them because I was convinced that was coming for me in return. I've got no faith in anybody liking me just as I am. Very peculiar. Just all these behaviors I built out of all of these things. And I guess an eating disorder was part of that package that I put together for myself. It's fascinating. It really is. I can kind of nail down a lot of the ways I behave, which I guess is a blessing to some degree because I don't want to be disassociated forever. I don't want to be that person who can't make the connections with emotional stuff. And that's where I was definitely headed before I put in some very, very firm boundaries.
But I think it makes so much sense, doesn't it? And so helpful for you just to talk about this openly. Because I think from my experience working with people with eating disorders, so often the real root of the issue is about not feeling good enough, not feeling worthy, not feeling lovable, maybe some issues with feeling not being seen or being abandoned. And then it's really tricky then, isn't it? Because I think if we felt we haven't been seen and validated and really cared for as we needed to be by our primary caregivers, then we go out into the world and we don't feel safe. We assume that we can't trust people, that people are going to leave us. We feel a very kind of fear-based response, I guess, to the world, rather than someone who's been brought up in an environment with a lot of love and care and support. They're automatically going to assume humans are good. People care about me. People look out for me. People are generally good. I feel safe in the world. But if you haven't had that experience, particularly in those early years, of course, it's going to be really hard, isn't it? To trust and to believe that you won't be abandoned again. And I guess as well, we need to be able to kind of form healthy relationships so we don't repeat those patterns, because often we unconsciously, and I'm not saying this is true for you, Prue, because it sounds like you've actually really carved out a different path there, but often I think people will choose people that will abandon them again because they kind of are unconsciously drawn to what feels familiar, because that's what we do as humans. And then it can really reinforce the cycle.
You were spot on, but also what I was seeing was I was recreating that behavior in the way I was treating people, not because I intentionally wanted to hurt them or make them feel bad, but just because in my mind, it couldn't ever be a successful friendship. And therefore, I will help it along by closing it down, by closing it down really fast. But I can't imagine how that must have made some people feel. I was doing that. I do feel awful about some of them, because it just never occurred to me. Never occurred to me that what I was doing was repetitive. And it's like that they say about that kind of trying to break that cycle, isn't it? Which is really hard. But yeah, so not just choosing someone who perhaps behaves the way my parents did, but me becoming like them without even realizing. Yeah. And it is very interesting. You sort of say all those different jigsaw pieces that kind of come together as you slowly make the connection, and just building something a bit better for yourself once you can kind of see trends and patterns in the way you're doing things. Yeah. In many ways, I feel incredibly lucky. Not everyone gets the privilege of having children and all of those kinds of things. And yeah, I feel very, very fortunate, especially with a variety of things, but my own behaviour really, I suppose.
Yeah, well, it sounds like I guess you've done some quite difficult work, haven't you, Prue? Really, I think until we become more aware of the patterns we're in and we understand our childhood and we can have passion and understanding for that little child that went through those difficult experiences, and we can start to, I guess, interpret the world through a more kind of realistic but and compassionate lens. That's only when we can change, isn't it? We have to kind of do that difficult work really and face sometimes what was not right for us in our early life. But the more we become conscious of the patterns we're in and the old cycles we get caught in, we can begin to have a choice, can't we? And be more intentional about the life we want to create, the people that we want to have in our lives, the boundaries we want to set, where we want to channel our energy. And I guess that is a very empowering and can be quite a joyful place as well, can't it? When we really step into that healed, much more healed place of really connecting back with the self. Yeah, then being in a better position to kind of create life, I guess, rather than feeling we're just overwhelmed with everything coming at us and feeling much more like a victim. And as a child, we are a victim, really, aren't we? There's not a lot we can do about it. We feel quite helpless and powerless, really. But I guess as adults, when we heal, we can then become much more conscious and intentional. We can create a very different life for ourselves, but it takes work, doesn't it? And it's not easy. I think all credit to you that I guess you're in the place that you're in now. And I'm not saying it's all perfect and all rainbows and unicorns, but I guess you're in a much more peaceful place now because of a lot of choices you've made and the work you've done on yourself, the awareness that you've created.
Yes, definitely. And actually, while I have the space to say it, I know social media gets a lot of bad press, but what it opened up for me was being able to recognize, because you have Instagram accounts where there's such a positive movement around people who've experienced eating disorders and how they can not only help themselves, but where they can find resources. And I do think that was a huge influence. Like, I listened to your podcast, there's others that are quite big out there, and being able to hear other people's stories, women, men, young people, older people, just all experiences in all different shapes and sizes, all different environments and backgrounds. And it's so vast. And I think it was that a bit also that way you can then think what I experienced was real. I wasn't just a silly little girl doing silly things. I was really suffering. And it's okay to recognize that and be vocal about it, and perhaps honor that little girl by protecting myself now in a way I would have appreciated back then. I do think that's quite empowering in terms of, podcasts and Instagram. It is a real help, a real tool to feel not part of something. You don't want to be part of things, just sort of, but just feeling not alone. That's it. That's exactly what I wanted as a child. I didn't want to be alone, and I was. And now I don't feel that way. I'm not alone. Experienced something that was really difficult, a lot like many other people. That's been huge.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think many people relate to that as well, actually. It is the wonderful thing, isn't it, about the sort of digital age, that there's a lot of disadvantages to it, but there's a lot of advantages as well, that we have got so much more access to information and knowledge and people's stories, and that can be very inspiring and inspirational and give us hope, I think, for recovery. And like you say, feeling part of something as well, actually, where you're far less alone. With humans, we want to be connected, even if we don't really realize it often. I think we really need to feel connected and seen and heard and understood.
Yeah, that's what I've managed to kind of find. And I'm ever so grateful being able to reflect on everything in a more positive way. Yeah, it's been a real gift, to be honest. So thank you. Thank you, Harriet.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Prue, for coming on the podcast and for telling your story. And I know these are often some of the listeners' favourite episodes, actually, just hearing people's stories. So I really appreciate you coming on, being really vulnerable and open and sharing. I know a lot of people will get a lot of hope and encouragement from this. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. I've loved it. Thank you.
So I hope you enjoyed this conversation just as much as I did. If you're not following me already, do seek me out on Instagram at the eating disorder therapist _ For further support with your relationship with food, do go to the eatingdisordertherapist.co.uk. You might also wish to subscribe to my Substack if you'd like to receive weekly blogs and articles all about eating disorders and tips and tricks from the therapy room. Thank you so much for listening today, and I look forward to sharing another podcast episode with you very soon.